Hi, folks. Now that you've read the two essays assigned for this week from Aaron Devor and Tyler Zimmer, I thought it'd be useful for me to provide a little bit of a lesson discussing these two readings and the concepts within them. As I've previously mentioned, this idea of understanding society's ideas about gender roles is important towards the paper that we're ultimately going to be writing. One of the paths that you can potentially take in the second paper is to analyze a visual text for the ideas that you see that text sending about gender. So it's useful for us to engage in this consideration of these ideas about gender, society's ideas about gender, that both Aaron Devor and Tyler Zimmer are presenting within their essays to give us a better understanding of this broader concept, so you can think about the issues that are associated with gender if that's the path that you take in your analysis. So thinking about Aaron Devor's essay, Devor tries to define gender roles in a way that can be helpful to us. A simple way to think about gender roles is that it refers to a set of ideas that men and women learn about how society expects their gender to act. So the key here when we're talking about gender roles is that we're talking about social expectations, societal expectations, not necessarily something that's biological about a person. Gender roles shift over time and within different cultures. Gender roles are the societal expectations of that particular time in regards to gender. Generally, traditionally in Western culture, there's the expectation of a certain set of characteristics that are associated with masculinity for men and femininity for women. Those are, again, the traditional expectations regarding gender roles in Western society in more modern times. Even those ideas of what's considered masculine and what's considered feminine, those things shift over time. A lot of the ideas that we have in the 21st century about what is masculine would differ significantly from the way people would have thought of masculine in the 1900s, for example, or in the 1800s. Times change and ideas about these gender roles do change, even within the same place, even within the same culture. So firstly, Devor tries to make clear, when we're talking about gender roles, we're not talking about biological differences. Whether there are biological differences between men's and women's bodies, that's not what this is talking about. Gender roles has to do with the ideas that society has about what it means to be male or female, what it means to be masculine for men or feminine for women. So these ideas about gender aren't necessarily inherent. They're not biologically built in any way. Most of the expectations we have about male or female behavior are socially learned. In other words, society tells us how we are expected to act. We learn these lessons at a young age, and we keep learning them, and they are often reinforced throughout our lives. So Devor is very interested in looking at how we as individuals get our ideas about gender from a very young age and how it's developed during our lifetime. Traditionally, the character traits that are associated with masculinity tend to include toughness, independence, dominance, being openly unemotional, being aggressive or competitive, and being sexually dominant. And that might include being promiscuous, but not necessarily emotionally attached. Now, just as an example of how we can analyze those types of traits within visual text, we have here just a simple still image of a cowboy, I guess. Now, this image does seem to exude a lot of these traditional, typical, almost stereotypical masculine characteristics. The guy himself seems to demonstrate toughness. Notice that he's the only one there, and he seems to be doing this on his own. He's independent. You could see dominance simply in his physique, but there also might be dominance in he's holding a saddle. He's got to physically dominate an animal, hopefully in a kind way, but he's going to, dominate an animal in some way. There's no signs necessarily of emotion here. He's openly unemotional. other than maybe being determined. There might be a kind of aggression or competitiveness in the setting that's going on here. We don't know if this is a rodeo or something like that. Now, there isn't necessarily something indicated in terms of sexually dominant here, but obviously he's, the image itself demonstrates him as an attractive man. Now, that's just a simple way we can look at an image and see some of the ideas that are being conveyed within it. This is a simple still image. It's not a film, a TV show. It's not telling a story. We're just seeing a simple image in itself. And yet there are ideas that are being conveyed through the way this image is actually crafted. The photographer is capturing this person in a particular way to demonstrate certain traits. Now, traditionally, the character traits that are associated with femininity include frailty and vulnerability, dependence, submissiveness, being openly emotional, being nurturing and cooperative, and to some degree being sexually available, yet not slutty. Now, this image on this screen here is an example that seems to capture a lot of these traits. If, for example, if you just do a Google search for feminine women, you'll find lots of images of women with flowers. They are either holding flowers, they have flowers on them in some way, or they're in a field of flowers. Our gentleman friend over here is not in a field of flowers. He's not got a flower tucked in his hat. This is a simple thing, but just the simple small elements within the image, it does seem to exude a kind of frailty. Flowers are frail. Now, some may also say it's like a symbol of fertility or something like that. But again, that's being applied to a woman, not to a man. There's different ideas that are being conveyed through this image. Notice in the look in this image, she's not looking even directly at the camera. She's looking away from the camera. There's a kind of submissiveness simply in her physical pose. She's not in an assertive body posture in any way. She's in a wrapped up kind of body posture. Now, again, this is one simple image where we can see some of these traits at play. Devor is not suggesting that men are like this and that women are like this. Devor is not suggesting that at all. Rather, the point that Devor is trying to make is that in Western culture, in modern society, there are ideas within society that expect women to have some of these traits and expect men to demonstrate some of these traits. Not everybody within the culture will have those ideas, but there are a lot of dominant traditional ideas about these character traits associated with masculinity or femininity. If a guy wants to be perceived as masculine within society, he's often expected to demonstrate these characteristics. If a woman wants to be perceived as feminine, she's expected to demonstrate these types of characteristics. So this is going to affect the behaviors that people engage in. For example, just a simple example. If a guy feels emotional about something that he sees or experiences, traditionally, men are encouraged not to show those emotions, not to cry openly. And if they cry, it's got to be that one single tear, not the weepy, messy tears. Whereas it's much more acceptable for women to be openly emotional of fears, concerns, being upset, and demonstrating that even through crying. So even when we have these differing ideas about gender and certainly evolving ideas about gender, many of those same traditional expectations still assert themselves in simple ways in terms of people's expectations of behavior. So part of what Devor looks at in their essay is thinking about how young people begin to learn their ideas about gender. And one of the things that Devor looks at is like some of the simple things that occur in young childhood. If you think about young childhood, often young kids learn to like certain things because they're given those things as gifts, and they get positive feedback from the people around them, often the adults around them. A simple example. Boys aren't necessarily, they don't come right out of the womb wanting to play competitive sports or wanting to play with trucks or cars. They tend to learn those types of behaviors and learn to like those types of things because they're often encouraged towards those types of activities or those types of toys. We can see the same thing happening for young girls at younger ages. The more likely they are to like those things, the more likely they are to have been exposed to them by family members, but it can go beyond the family. Let's say, for example, a parent says, I'm going to make sure that my kid doesn't have any like rigid ideas about gender roles. I'm going to make sure these boys know that they can play with dolls if they want, that they can engage in more nurturing and cooperating activities if they feel like it. A family may make that kind of conscious decision to go against some of the very traditional gender roles. And yet, we are not just developed by our parents. Our ideas are developed as we grow as people. We are exposed to other kids our age. We are exposed to media. We're exposed to television. We're exposed to film. We're exposed to commercials. All of the things that we, even as little kids, are exposed to do impact the way we perceive how gender is supposed to work, what we as boys or girls are supposed to act like. Now, we may not actually act like that. We may not follow the ideas that society might be sending us about gender. Yet we still get those messages. We still have to respond to those social expectations in one way or another. Some people may respond by rejecting them, by not wanting to be like those things. But we still are impacted by society's expectations, no matter how we individually respond. Now, if you think about like young people, young boys and girls, as they're growing up, you'll see that there are many traditions, there are many interactions that may occur in the middle school years and the high school years where a lot of the ideas about gender may be reinforced, particularly the traditional ideas about gender. For example, within the traditional American high school, you're going to see, like if you think just about film and television versions of high school, the guys that tend to be celebrated in film and television versions of high school tend to be guys that are successful in athletics. That is the number one way to be popular in the TV and film versions of high school. It might be true in some actual high schools too. But the TV and film versions of high schools seems to almost fixate on guys who are athletically successful. So the quarterback of the football team is going to be like a lead character in that particular teen drama. And again, according to that very traditional kind of stereotype, the young women who might be more popular and more successful within high school are those who are in more supportive roles that are traditionally associated with femininity, such as cheerleaders. Those are stereotypes. Film and television often utilizes those stereotypical expectations. In the actual real world, you may not have seen that in your own high school, but there might be some of that expectation at play. Some of the traditions that we have in high school, for example, you are very, very likely in high school to have gone to a pep rally for the football team. It's very unlikely that you went to a pep rally for the chess team or the brain bowl team. The traditions that we have in high school, such as pep rallies, such as homecoming, do celebrate and give some special influence to those who are fitting these very traditional expectations of gender. And not necessarily celebrating those who are not necessarily going to be perceived as obviously not fitting those traditional stereotypical ideas about masculinity, for example, or femininity, for example. So it's useful to think about the kinds of traditions that we have. Often the traditions are ones we don't examine. We have a pep rally because some of our students are working hard on the football team and we want to show them support. So it's well intended, of course. And the people who are doing it are intending positive things, of course. And yet those traditions, we often don't examine the effect that traditions may have. The traditions that we have may actually reinforce ideas about gender, even if we aren't consciously considering them. In television and film, a huge fixation in television and film has to do with prom in high school, which is odd. It's just one night in people's lives. And yet it's a huge focus in the high school, in the film and television versions of high school. And the expectations about prom often revolve around these traditional expectations of masculine and feminine behavior in terms of how people dress, in terms of who is going to be crowned king and queen, which is really odd. These are traditions that do reinforce traditional ideas about gender. Now, again, those who are behind the traditions, those who are, hosting the prom, don't necessarily think about, we're hosting this prom because we want to reinforce certain ideas about gender. No, they're just doing it because it's a high school tradition and they want the high school kids to have fun, to have a good experience. And yet the traditions themselves may reinforce ideas that we have about how gender is supposed to work. And often those ideas are keeping with much more traditional, more kind of old school visions of gender. Now, that's part of what Devor is trying to get us to think about. How we learn our ideas about gender and how they're reinforced during our lifetimes, not just in young childhood, but as we continue, as we grow, and even into adulthood. Even into adulthood, a lot of times, the ideas, traditional societal ideas about gender are going to be reinforced through negative social reinforcement. You can see negative social reinforcers occurring in young childhood, honestly, where you see, for example, a group of boys picking on a boy who isn't necessarily displaying appropriately masculine behaviors according to their expectations. And the way you're going to see a group of boys doing that is often by calling the other boy a name. And if you think about the types of names that those boys might call that less masculine boy, they're going to call that, the types of names they tend to be names that are associated with femininity. They imply something feminine about that boy. That's mean. It's bullying. Hopefully the kids around us don't actually act that way. But again, this commonly does occur. We can see that with young girls too, where they may be negative towards each other if, in, for example, the middle school years, one girl isn't necessarily fitting some of the other girls' expectations for feminine behavior. These are called negative social reinforcements. They might occur from peers. They might occur from people who are older, like let's say adults towards young children. They might occur from just the broader society itself. So if, for example, on social media, you demonstrate yourself in a way that doesn't necessarily fit society's expectations of gender, you might get negative reinforcements. You might get negative comments from people about that. Now, you might, as an individual, just say, who cares? This stuff isn't going to bother me. And yet you still have to deal with it. You still have to encounter it. And so it is going to impact you in some way. Even if you reject it, you still have to encounter it. So the big point to Devor's essay is that there's all these ideas about societal expectations about gender do influence us on an individual level, even if we all individually react differently to it. We still have to encounter it. And it's going to then impact the way we see ourselves. Now, what Devor ultimately gets to is talking about the concept of the patriarchal gender schema. This idea suggests that in most Western cultures, they're set up as patriarchies. Most cultures are. Traditionally, that has happened throughout history. Not in every culture, but in many cultures, we have patriarchies in which men are in charge. Men have most of the social and political and economic power. In those types of societies, the men get the power and they use the logic, or the society uses the logic, that masculine behavior makes them better leaders. So if you go back to our list of these traits that are traditionally associated with masculinity: toughness, independence, dominance, being unemotional, being aggressive and competitive, a lot of those things seem to coincide with the traits that we associate with leadership. Whereas being submissive, being dependent, and even being openly emotional are not necessarily traits that are associated with leadership. So Devor's big point here is that the ideas that are associated with leadership in patriarchal societies just so happen to be the ones that are associated with masculinity. And therefore, that's why we end up with a lot more men in charge. That's why a lot more men end up in positions of power, because there's this expectation that to be a leader, one has to be tough and dominant and openly unemotional. And if people have adhered to relatively traditional gender stereotypes, then that's more likely to have been men in those types of roles. So Devor's argument is that patriarchal societies often suggest that women are inherently poor leaders because if they are feminine, they aren't going to necessarily demonstrate as many of those masculine behaviors that are associated with leaderships. Now, you'll unfortunately see in many societies, when women do seek leadership roles, they're often ridiculed as having masculine traits through unpleasant jokes, sexist memes, that type of stuff. Often there are sexist questions or statements that are made about women that seek leadership positions. And so that does not just discourage those particular women. In fact, it might not discourage those particular women, but it will sometimes discourage other women who are seeking to maybe be more in leadership roles when they see that type of negative behavior towards a more high-profile person who's seeking to be in leadership, particularly a leadership that is traditionally masculine, traditionally male. Now, again, going back to thinking about these different gender roles or stereotypes, that set of characteristics that is associated with masculinity and that set of characteristics that's traditionally associated with femininity, most psychologists would tell you it is not healthy for anyone to be just one of those categories. So, for example, if you're a guy and you're just exudes toughness and independence, then you're going to have a hard time being able to work with others. You're going to have been taught to be competitive in many situations rather than learning to get along. If that's solely how you try to construct your character, if you're so fixated on dominance, you're not necessarily going to be a good partner or a good friend. You're going to have a hard time in romantic relationships if you always have to be the one in charge. That's not healthy. It's not healthy as a man to be always feeling like you can't show your emotions. Devor notes that one of the, and our other author also talks about this, one of the only emotions that men seem to be allowed to show in this very traditional expectation is anger. But fear, vulnerability, sadness, anxiety, these are emotions that we all feel. Those are much less encouraged in terms of showing them openly. Now, if you think about these even in terms of romantic relationships, if a guy can't show his emotions, his vulnerability, his anxiety, his fears to the person that he's in love with, then he's not going to really be truly emotionally connecting with that person. He's not really giving them the full version of himself. That's not healthy. He's probably going to be hiding a lot, keeping a lot to himself because he feels like it's unmasculine to have shared more. That wouldn't be healthy. So that's a simple way. If someone was actually, as a guy, trying to be all of these characteristics and they had been trained in their lifetime to think as a man, you must simply be all these things, you're probably going to have difficulty in relationships and maybe even difficulty in friendships, because being a friend requires being vulnerable. It requires not being dominant. It requires showing your emotions to really keep and maintain friendships in adulthood. That's required. As a woman, if a person is all of these traits, if they're frail and vulnerable all of the time, if they always exude dependence and they're not willing to just sort of stand up on their own and be independent, if they're always submissive, they're going to get walked all over in the work world, in relationships. That's not healthy. That's not going to lead to a very happy life. They have to hope that they find people to protect them that aren't going to take advantage of their vulnerability or dependence or submissiveness. But that's a vulnerable position to be in. Now, most psychologists would tell you, obviously, whatever your gender, it makes sense to have a combination of these traits. It is psychologically healthy to have a combination of these traits, to have some sense of toughness and independence, but to be able to be vulnerable and dependent, to be able to be dominant in some situations and submissive in others, and sometimes changing even in the same relationship, to be able to be emotional with the people that matter, to be able to share your emotions openly and not just anger. Even as a leader, to not just be tough, but to be able to be cooperative, to be able to nurture those around you. All of those types of traits are necessary for any healthy person, regardless of your gender. So again, psychologists would tell us it's not healthy just to be all one or all the other in terms of these very traditional stereotypes about masculinity and femininity. A healthy, psychologically healthy person is going to be a balance of those traits. Now, obviously, society's ideas about gender have changed over time. They are always changing over time. Again, go back to the 1800s, and there'll be very different ideas about gender than even existed in the late 1900s or the early 2000s. Society's ideas about gender change over time. Just a simple example. If you go back to the late 1800s, you will find lots of young boys wearing dresses. That was very common for 1, 2, 3-year-old boys to wear dresses. That wasn't associated with femininity. By the time you got to the late 1900s, young boys in dresses would have been associated with femininity. So that's just a simple thing. Even, for example, the color pink. The color pink was not associated with anything feminine in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. That only starts to change in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. In the mid 1900s, does that color idea start to be associated with a particular gender? Society's ideas about gender certainly change over time. What I would suggest is that one of the things that's worth thinking about is, even if our ideas are changing on an individual level and we see society's ideas changing, how do we see those ideas being reflected in film and television? How do we see them being reflected in media? In some cases, for example, in a TV show that you watch, you might see these changing expectations about gender in terms of behavior. In some places, you might not see those changes. You might see a very traditional idea about gender. That's part of what you can examine when you're looking at a particular film, TV show, or other visual text for this paper. Now, let's sort of move towards talking about Tyler Zimmer's essay. Tyler Zimmer's essay is entitled "Men Are Monstrous, but Men Aren't Monstrous, but Masculinity Can Be." Now, Zimmer's essay is really talking about this concept of toxic masculinity. Now, toxic masculinity itself would probably best be understood as going back to all those traits that Devor talked about here: toughness, independence, dominance, being openly unemotional, except in terms of anger, being aggressive, being competitive, being sexually dominant. Toxic masculinity thinks about the harm that men just focusing on that particular set of characteristics does to them and those around them. Zimmer's argument is that this is ultimately harmful to men. It's not healthy if a man is told he's not supposed to be able to share his emotions with others. Just think of a simple, common example of an experience that we see in television and film. A couple breaking up. In TV and film, we frequently see representations of a straight couple breaking up. And the girl will go out with her friends and she'll cry and she'll maybe drink and she'll probably sit on the couch and eat ice cream. That's what you'll see in a lot of TV shows, for example. Guys in those situations, when they have their heart broken, are much less likely to be shown in television and film as sitting on the couch crying, eating ice cream. They're much less likely to be shown with friends really sharing their emotions. Instead, when they're with friends, the friends are distracting them. Let's go do this fun thing. They're not necessarily dealing with their emotions with friends, with male friends usually. So if you think about that, that's a simple thing, breaking up. Breaking up, you have heartbreak on both sides, right? And yet, television and film often shows us women dealing with their emotions and having support from other women in dealing with those emotions by expressing them, by talking about them, and they get support. Whereas traditionally, we don't have a lot of examples where men have the space to share their emotions openly, honestly, even vulnerably with other men. It's often much more private, and it's often less shown. Zimmer would argue that's toxic. It's dangerous for guys not to be able to just process their emotions and have others who can support them. It's not helpful when guys feel like they're not being properly masculine by having emotions. If this idea about masculinity tells men that the only emotions they can really have and show openly involve anger, then that's going to be a pretty unhealthy response to heartbreak, for example. That tends to lead to very, very bad outcomes for all involved. So part of what Zimmer wants us to think about is the impact this can have on relationships. If, for example, in a relationship, a man is not comfortable with being openly emotional with their partner, that's going to lead to a lack of emotional connection. It might negatively impact social interactions as well. If you think about that list of traditional stereotypes that are associated with masculine behavior, men are often expected to be dominant, aggressive, competitive. In social situations, sometimes it's not helpful to be dominant, aggressive, or competitive. I'll give you a simple example. If you ever have a job, you have to sometimes just shut up and take it. You have to do the thing that you think is stupid. You have to follow orders even when you think they're wrong. That's called life. Welcome to having a job. In any job, you're going to see this. If you work in retail or you work in a restaurant, you're going to have customers that are obnoxious and they're wrong and they're rude, and you're still going to have to say, have a nice day. How can I help you? You're still going to have to just be nice. You're going to have bosses that sometimes make unreasonable orders. You're going to have to put up with it. Now, for a lot of men in particular, they feel like that's not being dominant. That's not showing their aggression. That's not showing their independence. And therefore, if they kind of exude all of these types of traits, they're much less likely to be able to be stable in the workplace. They're much less likely to blow up and not take it. That's not healthy. That's not good for a person in terms of their development in life. Everybody, regardless of your gender, you're gonna have to learn sometimes to not be dominant in the workplace. You're gonna have to learn to sometimes just be submissive, go along, follow, do what you're told. That's part of life. And yet, if a man is feeling like that's stripping away his masculinity, then often they're gonna have negative attitudes about work in that type of situation. And often that leads to negative behaviors. So if we think sorry, I'm going back to my question here. If we think about the kinds of impact that has on social interactions, it might be even things as simple as how it affects people in the work world, how it affects people in their personal relationships, how it affects people in terms of their friendships. Now, again, I kind of going back to that example I was giving on television and film of people in breakups. We don't see just like film and television giving young men a lot of healthy ways to deal with rejection. We rarely see people dealing with rejection, particularly young men, dealing with rejection in healthy ways in TV and film. If you think about just simple rejection, like a guy asks a girl out on a date and he gets turned down. A lot of times what you'll see in television and film is that guy is taught that the film kind of celebrates the guy continuing to try. He's persistent. He keeps harassing her until she says yes. He keeps trying to show what a great guy he is until she says yes. That's not a particularly healthy behavior. He's a creep. Yet that creep kind of behavior is encouraged repeatedly in TV and film. It's telling men, don't accept rejection. That if you're going to be a real man, you're not going to accept rejection. You're going to keep persisting. Well, that's called being a stalker. That's not healthy, obviously. To be more dark about it, to be honest, if you watch the news every week, you will see examples of domestic shootings. And we're talking about domestic shootings. Usually what we're talking about is a couple that breaks up. And almost every time in those types of situations, it's a guy who has come upon this woman who has rejected him in some way, and he shoots her. We have way too many examples of that in American culture. And it's traditionally men that do that, not women. Women have just as much ability to do something horrible with a gun. And yet it's far more likely for a man to do that. The most likely person who will ever shoot a woman in that woman's life is their romantic partner. That is statistically true, by far, overwhelmingly so. And yet there's a weird gender imbalance on that. It's much more likely that men are likely to deal with rejection in violent ways, in violent, destructive, incoherent, stupid ways. Maybe that's because they haven't seen models of healthy ways to deal with rejection, to deal with heartbreak, to deal with betrayal, if that's occurred. That they haven't really gotten good models of that. The kinds of places we might get models of that would be maybe in our personal lives, maybe in our family, but we are exposed to lots of stories of heartbreak, of betrayal, of rejection in TV and film. And so it's worth thinking about the types of models that people get for how to deal with that stuff through what we see in television and film. Okay. So I think that's all I really wanted to discuss with these two readings. I'm hoping that this discussion has given you more to think about and it helps you see the ideas that both Devor and Zimmer are talking about in this broader context of how you might actually use this stuff to analyze a piece of film or television or other visual text for the ideas that are being conveyed about gender within it.